Long before the world wrote history books, Africa was already making history. This is the birthplace of mighty empires, of fearless warriors, of kings and queens who led with wisdom, and of voices that rose even when the world tried to silence them. From Mandela's courage to Sankara's fire, from Queen Nzinga's strength to Lumumba's sacrifice, Africa's heroes have carried the weight of nations and the dreams of generations. Short pause, tone becomes personal. And if you're here today, Covefons, it's because you believe those stories matter. You believe Africa's voice deserves to be heard, not just in history books, but across every screen, every platform, every heart. So I invite you with all my heart to be part of something meaningful. Support this journey, support this mission, support the New World Playbook. Click that subscribe button, give this video a like, drop your thoughts in the comments, and share this message with someone who needs to hear it. Together, we're not just remembering Africa's heroes, we're continuing their legacy. Africa's heroes, fighters for independence. History is not neutral. It is often written by the powerful, framed by victors, and shaped by those who control the pen. For centuries, the story of Africa was told through the lens of conquest. Kingdoms reduced to footnotes, civilizations buried under maps drawn in Berlin, and generations defined by servitude, silence, and subjugation. But that is only half the truth. This is the other half, the side of the story written in defiance and resistance, carved into the soil by the footsteps of freedom fighters, whispered through the bars of colonial prisons, and carried in the chants of millions who rose up and said, "No more." Welcome to Africa's heroes, fighters for independence, a journey across the continent to meet the courageous men and women who led their people out of the darkness of colonial rule and into the uncertain dawn of freedom. These are not just names in history books. These are voices that once echoed through the battlefields, the courtrooms, the villages, and the halls of power. Their vision was bold, their struggle immense, and their sacrifices often final. From Algeria's mountains to Zimbabwe's fields, from Ghana's streets to Congo's forests, from the prisons of South Africa to the jungles of Mozambique, Africa's path to independence was neither quick nor easy. It was not given, it was taken. Taken by force, by negotiation, by blood, by ballot, and by belief. A continent under siege. At the height of the 20th century, nearly every inch of Africa was claimed by European empires. Great Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, Spain, and others carved up the land like a prize, indifferent to the lives, cultures, and sovereignties of people. What followed was not development, but domination. Africa was plundered of its resources, its labor, and its agency. Its children were taught to admire the conqueror, to speak foreign tongues, and to forget their own greatness. But not everyone forgot. There were those who remembered the ancient empires of Mali, Aksum, Kush, and Zimbabwe. Those who remembered the freedom of their ancestors and who could not accept living under foreign rule. They organized, protested, fought, wrote, preached, negotiated, and when all else failed, took up arms. Some wore suits, others carried rifles, and many wore nothing but the scars of resistance. The spark of liberation. The mid-20th century saw an eruption of liberation movements across Africa. The world was changing. World War II had weakened colonial powers, and the tide of independence was rising. Inspired by global anti-imperial movements, African leaders emerged to speak for their people, and more importantly, to act. Kwame Nkrumah would lead Ghana to become the first independent nation in sub-Saharan Africa. Ahmed Ben Bella and the FLN would wage a brutal war in Algeria. Patrice Lumumba would speak the truth too loudly in Congo and pay with his life. Dedan Kimathi would lead a forest rebellion in Kenya, hanged by the British but immortalized in freedom. Some fought with words, like Julius Nyerere, who taught his people the value of dignity and unity. Others fought with fire, like Samora Machel in Mozambique and Agostinho Neto in Angola, who drove out colonial armies from the south. They came from villages and cities, from royal families and humble homes. Some were teachers, others were farmers, lawyers, soldiers, or poets. But they all shared one thing: the unshakable belief that Africa could govern itself. More than borders. This is not just a story of individual nations gaining flags and anthems. It is the story of a continental awakening, a rising tide that swept from Cairo to Cape Town. It's a reminder that Africa's freedom was never a gift from empire. It was won in struggle, forged in unity, and paid for in blood. This video does not seek to romanticize. These heroes were not perfect. Some would later fall to dictatorship, corruption, or conflict. But their fight for independence, that initial struggle, remains a monumental chapter in human history, one that must be told by us, in our voice, with our truth. Because the lion has begun to write. What you'll see in this film, we will explore the lives and legacies of the most iconic and often overlooked African freedom fighters. We will trace their paths through exile, battlefields, speeches, betrayals, and triumphs. We will hear their words, understand their causes, and reflect on what their victories meant and still mean today. Some names you may know, others you may be meeting for the first time. All of them played a part in changing the face of Africa forever. So let us begin, not with empire, but with resistance, not with surrender, but with courage, not with chains, but with the fire that broke them. This is the story of Africa's heroes, fighters for independence. North Africa, the first sparks of fire. In the windswept deserts and crowded cities of North Africa, resistance to colonial rule took root earlier than in many other parts of the continent. Long under the thumb of foreign powers, particularly France and Britain, North African nations were among the first to rebel, organize, and win their independence. Here, the fight was not only political, but profoundly violent, deeply ideological, and internationally significant. Let us explore three pivotal figures: Ahmed Ben Bella of Algeria, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, and Habib Bourguiba of Tunisia, each a towering presence in the dawn of African liberation. Ahmed Ben Bella and the Algerian Revolution. Algeria's fight for independence is one of the bloodiest chapters in the entire decolonization movement. Under French rule since 1830, Algeria was treated not as a colony, but as an extension of France itself, a department of the French Republic. Over 1 million European settlers lived in Algeria by the mid-20th century, enjoying full rights, while the native Algerian population remained second-class citizens in their own land. Born in 1916 to a modest farming family, Ahmed Ben Bella would become the face of Algerian resistance. A soldier in the French army during World War II, he returned home disillusioned by the hypocrisy of fighting for French liberty while his own people remained oppressed. In 1954, Ben Bella co-founded the Front de Libération Nationale, FLN, a revolutionary movement committed to violent resistance against French rule. The FLN launched a coordinated uprising on November 1, 1954, beginning an 8-year war for independence. The Algerian War was brutal. Villages were bombed. Civilians were tortured. Over 1.5 million Algerians would die. France responded with overwhelming military force, but the FLN's Gamal Abdel Nasser, the giant of Arab African independence. To understand the importance of Gamal Abdel Nasser, we must remember that Egypt, though technically independent by 1922, remained under tight British control, particularly of its military economy and the strategically vital Suez Canal. Born in 1918 in Alexandria, Nasser rose through the ranks of the military with a burning desire to free his country from imperial influence. In 1952, he and a group of officers known as the Free Officers Movement overthrew King Farouk, ending the monarchy and beginning a new era for Egypt. As president, Nasser declared war on foreign domination, not just in Egypt, but across the region. His most dramatic act came in 1956, when he nationalized the Suez Canal, a lifeline of global trade previously controlled by Britain and France. This triggered the Suez Crisis, with Britain, France, and Israel launching a joint military invasion. But under international pressure, and with support from the US and the Soviet Union, the invaders were forced to withdraw. Egypt stood victorious. It was a stunning defeat for the old imperial powers and a defining moment for post-colonial assertiveness. Nasser became a symbol not only of Arab nationalism, but of African resistance. He co-founded the Non-Aligned Movement, offering a third path during the Cold War, and supported numerous liberation movements across Africa, from Algeria to Zimbabwe. He who cannot support himself cannot help others. Under Nasser, Egypt also became a training ground for African revolutionaries. His speeches echoed across the continent, urging self-determination and dignity. Despite flaws in his governance and setbacks in the later Six-Day War of 1967, Nasser's place in history as one of the continent's most influential leaders is undeniable. He gave voice and strength to a new Africa, unafraid to challenge old empires. Habib Bourguiba, the diplomat of dignity. While Algeria fought with guns and Egypt with politics, Tunisia achieved its independence through a different kind of resistance, one led by debate, diplomacy, and determined negotiation. Habib Bourguiba, born in 1903, studied law in Paris before returning to Tunisia to challenge French colonial rule. He founded the Neo-Destour Party, mobilizing mass support and tirelessly campaigning for gradual but full independence. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Bourguiba understood the power of strategic patience. He worked to build international sympathy, taking Tunisia's case before the United Nations and leveraging pressure on France. After years of civil unrest and political pressure, Tunisia finally gained its independence in 1956, the same year as Morocco. Bourguiba became the country's first prime minister and then president. Known as a modernizer, he championed education, women's rights, and secular government. He once said, "We must liberate the mind as we have liberated the land." While not a revolutionary in the military sense, Bourguiba was a hero of independence, proving that diplomacy could be just as powerful as armed struggle. A region that lit the path, North Africa's independence movements were early sparks that ignited the fire of liberation across the continent. They taught the rest of Africa that colonial power was not invincible. Whether through rebellion or negotiation, nations could reclaim their sovereignty. Algeria showed the world the cost of freedom. Egypt showed the world the importance of courage and leadership. Tunisia showed the world the strength of diplomacy. And together they reminded the continent that Africa would no longer be ruled from afar. West Africa, the cradle of Pan-Africanism. West Africa was the first region in sub-Saharan Africa to achieve independence. From the intellectual circles of Dakar to the fiery speeches in Accra, this region birthed the ideas, leaders, and movements that laid the ideological foundation for African liberation. Kwame Nkrumah, prophet of African unity. In 1957, Ghana became the first African country to gain independence from colonial rule under the visionary leadership of Kwame Nkrumah. Born in Nkrumah in 1909, Nkrumah was educated abroad and deeply influenced by global anti-imperialist thinkers like Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois. He returned to the Gold Coast and co-founded the Convention People's Party, CPP, rallying millions behind the slogan, "Self-Government Now." Nkrumah's mass mobilization and civil disobedience campaigns forced the British to concede. The independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of Africa. As Ghana's first prime minister and later president, Nkrumah dedicated Ghana's resources to supporting freedom fighters across Africa. He envisioned a United States of Africa, warning that political independence without economic and continental unity would leave Africa vulnerable. Though overthrown in a 1966 coup, Nkrumah's legacy remains as one of the most powerful voices for African dignity, unity, and identity. Sékou Touré, the man who said no. While most French colonies agreed to remain in a French community in 1958, only Guinea under Ahmed Sékou Touré voted no. This single act of defiance shook the French Empire. "We prefer poverty and liberty to riches in slavery." France retaliated by withdrawing abruptly, destroying infrastructure, and cutting off supplies. But Guinea stood firm. Touré declared independence, becoming Guinea's first president. Though later criticized for authoritarian rule, Touré's courage in facing down French threats set an example for others across the continent. He became a key Pan-Africanist, hosting freedom fighters and aligning with Nkrumah and Nasser. Léopold Sédar Senghor. The philosopher Leader Senghor, a poet and intellectual, championed African culture through the Negritude movement. Though Senegal's path to independence was less violent, Senghor's leadership emphasized the restoration of African pride and identity. As president, 1960 to 1980, he promoted democracy, education, and arts. He believed that liberation was as much cultural and psychological as it was political. To be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. Central and East Africa, resistance and martyrdom, approximately 1,800 words. This region's independence struggles were often marked by betrayal, assassination, and chaos, but also by fierce patriotism and sacrifice. Patrice Lumumba, the voice they silenced. Patrice Lumumba was just 35 years old when Congo gained independence in 1960, with him as its first prime minister. A fiery speaker and a firm believer in Pan-African unity, Lumumba stood against Belgian interference. In his famous independence speech, he shocked colonial authorities by openly denouncing their cruelty, refusing to let history be sanitized. "We are no longer your monkeys." But his defiance came at a price. Just months later, Lumumba was overthrown in a CIA and Belgian-backed coup. He was imprisoned, tortured, and executed in secrecy. His murder remains one of the most tragic moments of Africa's independence era. To this day, Lumumba is seen as a martyr, a man who dared to demand true sovereignty and died for it. Dedan Kimathi and the Mau Mau Uprising. In Kenya, independence came through armed struggle. Between 1952 and 1960, the Mau Mau Rebellion shook the foundations of British rule. At its head was Dedan Kimathi, a charismatic commander who led fighters through the forests of Mount Kenya. Branded a terrorist by the British, he was eventually captured and executed in 1957, 3 years before Kenya's independence. But to Kenyans, Kimathi was and is a national hero. "We have not been defeated. Our blood will feed the tree of freedom." His sacrifice laid the foundation for leaders like Jomo Kenyatta to take the reins of a new nation. Julius Nyerere, the gentle liberator in Tanganyika, now Tanzania, Julius Nyerere achieved independence through diplomacy and moral leadership. Known as Mwalimu, the teacher, Nyerere believed in African socialism, unity, and rural self-reliance. Under his leadership, Tanganyika gained independence in 1961 without war. Nyerere also supported anti-colonial fighters in Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and South Africa, turning Tanzania into a haven for liberation. Freedom is not measured by elections alone, but by the ability to live in dignity. Southern Africa, liberation through fire. Southern Africa's liberation was the longest and most militarized. In these nations, colonizers held on fiercely, and freedom came only through long, costly wars. Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo. In Zimbabwe, formerly Rhodesia, white minority rule under Ian Smith resisted African majority rule for decades. Two guerrilla movements, ZANU under Robert Mugabe and ZAPU under Joshua Nkomo, waged war from the 1960s through the late 1970s. After a protracted conflict, Zimbabwe finally won independence in 1980. Though Mugabe's legacy would later be marred by dictatorship, his role in the independence struggle remains historically significant. Samora Machel, warrior president Samora Machel, led Mozambique's Frelimo Liberation Front against Portuguese rule, using guerrilla tactics and political strategy. When Portugal's regime fell in 1974, Machel became the first president of Mozambique. International solidarity is not an act of charity, but an act of justice. He championed healthcare, education, and liberation throughout southern Africa until his death in a suspicious 1986 plane crash. Agostinho Neto, the revolutionary poet, Neto led the MPLA against Portuguese forces in Angola. Educated as a doctor, he used both poetry and arms to fight colonialism. After independence in 1975, he served as Angola's first president until his death in 1979. Nelson Mandela and the Long Walk to Freedom. South Africa's apartheid regime was the last colonial-style system to fall. The African National Congress, ANC, led decades of resistance, peaceful at first, then armed through Umkhonto we Sizwe. Nelson Mandela, a former lawyer turned militant, spent 27 years in prison for his activism. His courage and forgiveness became the foundation for a peaceful transition to democracy in 1994. I have walked that long road to freedom. I can only rest for a moment, for with freedom comes responsibility. Mandela became South Africa's first black president, a living icon of resistance and reconciliation. Pan-Africanism and the dream of unity. These heroes didn't fight alone. They were part of a continental movement. Pan-Africanism was not just an idea, it was a strategy. Leaders trained each other, hosted exiles, and funded revolutions. The Organization of African Unity, OAU, was founded in 1963 to promote cooperation and end colonialism. Figures like Nkrumah, Nasser, and Nyerere led this charge. Though the dream of a fully united Africa remains unfinished, the vision of a free, independent continent became real because of their collective struggle. The struggle continues. The fight for independence was never just about land or governance. It was about dignity, identity, and the right to exist as Africans. The heroes we've remembered today laid the foundation for a new world. But freedom is not a finish line. Many nations faced internal struggles, authoritarianism, and neo-colonial exploitation. The journey continues through education, innovation, democracy, and culture. Africa is rising, not because it is being saved, but because it is remembering itself. As we honor these heroes, may we not merely celebrate them, but continue the work they began. Africa's heroes live on, in memory, in legacy, and these are the giants whose footsteps echo through the soil of Africa. Warriors, visionaries, freedom fighters, healers, and builders. Africa's heroes were not just leaders of their time, but architects of hope, identity, and resistance. From the kingdoms of the past to the struggles for independence, and now to the innovators of today, their courage lives on in every generation that dares to rise. Africa's story is not just a story of struggle, it's a story of greatness, of kings and queens who ruled with wisdom, of fighters who stood with courage, of thinkers who dreamed beyond borders. These heroes, they didn't just shape history, they gave us a reason to be proud, to stand tall, and to never forget where we come from. Now it's our turn to carry their legacy forward. If this story moved you, inspired you, or taught you something new, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to this channel, The New World Playbook, where history meets the future and voices from Africa are heard across the world. Join the movement. Keep the legacy alive. Your support means everything, not just to me, but to the future we're trying to build together.